So thank you for joining the panel today entitled New Technologies Panel. We actually have a great mix on our panel. We've got 2 investors and 2 technology solution providers. Now, I think as a format, this is going to be a real discussion type panel. So please put in your questions as you go along, use the chat, and I will do my best to answer those questions. But without wasting time, because I know time is actually limited, why don't we start with some introductions? So we'll start with the 2 companies. So perhaps, Susan, you'd like to start by introducing yourself, and then Adam.
Okay, well, hello everyone, and thank you for inviting me today. I'm Susan Davies. I work for NatureMetrics. So we are an eDNA-based biodiversity monitoring company. And so just to explain, eDNA stands for environmental DNA. So basically the concept is that as animals move through the environment, then they leave behind traces of DNA. So this can be through saliva, mucus, shedding cells, and so forth. So what we do is we take samples from soils, from water, from sediments, and we can basically extract the DNA from those samples. We can put them through high throughput sequencers, and we can identify all of the species that are present. And we can literally do this for different taxonomic groups, running all the way from bacteria right up through sort of invertebrates and vertebrates. So you can literally get a sense of the microbiome, the soil, bacteria, fauna, right through, we say, from bacteria to blue whales, although, as I say, blue whales are not really very relevant for forestry. But yes, so we can do lots of different taxonomic groups. And so we can provide sort of data at scale from which to build metrics. And this can be used for sort of baselining, for ongoing monitoring, but we can also look for individual species. So if you're looking for particular protected species or invasive species or indicator species, then we can also do that. So the technology is particularly good for freshwater because it's a good mixture and source of DNA. So if you've got sort of streams or sort of lakes on a project, that's always good. But we can also, as I say, do from soils and sediments. The other thing we can do, which is very interesting, we can take so the more sort of traditional traps of insects. So if you gather lots and lots of insects where you might have a more traditional approach where the ecologist would have to physically identify individual insects. And again, we can turn it into a sort of insect soup, as we call it. And then we can put the whole lot through a sequencer and find all the insects very rapidly. And also, very interestingly, because insects actually bite and sort of sting and feed off feces and all those sorts of things, we can actually pick up DNA from the animals that they feed on as well. So it's a very comprehensive sort of service. We're moving now also towards looking at ecosystem health. So we can look at the composition, so we can look at soils, we can look at communities, so we can look at the state of health of soils. So in particular, if you're doing sort of regeneration style projects, particularly if you have a reference, then we can look at sort of, if there's, let's say, a more native, pristine forest nearby, we can look at the soil in there and the soil on your project, and we can do comparisons to see if it's moving towards where it should be. So that's the kind of thing we can do. And as I say, it's a very comprehensive service, much faster than more traditional measures. And also, you can get sort of your local consultants, contractors, or employees to take the samples and effectively mail them to us. So that has a cost reduction potential. So we're quite well established now. We've been running for 5 years. We've got over 150 clients. We work with sort of big players such as Anglo American, who are using us for sort of net positive. We work with sort of conservation organisations like WWF, FFI, and we've worked with a lot of the big environmental consultancies, so sort of ERM, Jacobs, WSP, those sorts of guys. And as I say, we've done lots of different, serving lots of different environments. We've included forestry, forests in lots of different types of projects. And so we've looked at translocation of soils, and we've done sort of impacts where we've had, say, gas pipelines going through forests. We've worked on RED projects, and at the moment we're doing a 200,000 sort of hectare forestry project in South America, which is a mixture of commercial restoration and native woodland. So that's a very quick introduction, but hopefully gives you a flavour of eDNA and its power.
Thank you, Susan. Adam?
Yeah, sure. And likewise, thank you everybody for having me today and the opportunity to speak to you all. So I'm Adam Filby. I work for Dendra Systems. We're an ecologically driven technology company, and we use a combination of specialized data ecology, machine learning driven analytics, and aerial seeding to both optimize scale, but to also bring transparency to ecosystem restoration projects. So we're very much focused on biodiversity restoration as a co-benefit, obviously, to nature-based carbon sequestration. We provide a range of insights. So we use different remote sensing techniques to gather data combined with ground-based surveys to really provide a full assessment of an ecosystem. As I mentioned, we're really very much focused on early stage restoration. So years 5 to 10 before you can actually see, potentially what's happening using traditional satellite-based survey methods. We produce a range of insights that survey the safety of a restoration project, this, landform stability, for example, the potential and risk of erosion to a particular project. We then look at fauna and flora in incredible detail, not quite at the level that Susan and NatureMetrics look at the eDNA level, but we analyze, we're able to see every blade of grass, every leaf, and also some of the surface fauna within a particular environment. And because of that level of granularity, because of that detail, we're able to provide some very accurate insights. We don't work on estimates or assumptions. We're actually working on every single centimetre of a particular restoration project and providing you the insights from that. So we look at the target species to see whether they're tracking against progress or expectations for a particular project. We're then looking at threats to the restoration projects. So we're looking at, is there invasive flora that's actually outperforming the target species, and is there again invasive fauna, which could be potentially either that's could be feral, could be grazing pressure on a particular rehabilitation project. And then we're measuring the health again using remote sensing methods of the ecosystem, and then looking at as well whether it's what the carbon absorption levels are as well. And again, we're not doing that based on estimates. We're actually using absolute data on a per plant basis. We're able to see every single plant within an ecosystem and track its progress in its metrics as well. Very similar customer base to the one that Susan outlined. We overlap there. We've got extensive experience working with mining companies where they're working on very degraded land and restoring that to again back to native ecosystems. So look forward to the discussion and look forward to taking your questions. Thank you.
Nainish, please introduce yourself.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I'm Nani Schwabl. I'm CIO of a single family office based in London. And for those of you who don't understand, excuse me for talking the basics here, but a family office typically has a slightly different investment structure for most institutional funds, in that many single family offices have a much broader remit in investment strategies. So whereas your typical investment fund will be saying we're doing 15-year forestry projects or we're just doing early stage deals, as a family office, we are happy to look at all elements of an investment. So at the same, whilst we're looking to do a forestry deal where we're putting the money away for 50 years, at the same time, we're happy to invest in startups to monitor it or to make it more efficient or to capitalize in some other way. So essentially, we're seeking to work in the ecosystem, investment ecosystem, in all levels. Thank you.
Thank you, Nainish. Actually, Nainish just done my intro as well, because I also am a family office, a single family office, just making it forest focused. I think we've been investing in forests for about 25 years. When we started to do it, it was mainly, I would say, not just about the environment, in honesty. It was probably about an inflation hedge. In those days, people always thought timber was a great hedge to inflation, and it probably still is. But I think as time's gone by, we've really cared about what we call impact investing. I hate to use terminologies like impact, but biodiversity is key for us. When we invest in a project, as Nani said, these are long-term projects. We want to make sure there's some good that comes out of that. So maybe this is a good way to start the conversation, and for me to ask Susan and Adam. I mean, when we get presented a proposal as an investor, I'm sometimes shocked about the lack of data that is presented to me on biodiversity. How do you think your solutions can help me be comfortable that at the outset, so before we've even thought about planting a tree, as in, how do we do an analysis to say what's there and what should be done?
Shall I start answering that? I mean, from our point of view, we obviously have a team of experts, and it does depend on the type of project. So if it's, a restoration project or a plantation, and, so we would have to, we would obviously offer advice for that specific project. And, it would depend on sort of, to what extent there was water on site and all those sort of factors. And I guess where we try and come from is, there's a lot of debate about, what metrics are people developing. And the big problem with all of that is, as you say, there's a lack of data behind it. So from an eDNA point of view, we are that big data solution, this new technology that you can take samples across your site, and you can basically, as I've said before, go right from bacteria to vertebrates up to invertebrates. So we have that sort of data at scale that we can give you across your project, and hope that from that basis, you've got as much data as possible from which to build your metrics in future. The great thing about DNA as well is we can store those samples. So once we process them, we can record that information. If you say in 5 years' time, well, actually, we wish we'd looked at X, we can go back and look for it. If you have, for example, if you wanting to demonstrate, that you're bringing biodiversity back, depending on the project, we can look for baseline, we can look for sort of protected species, for example. So, if a number of years down the line, a protected species appears and it wasn't there before, we can add that value. So it's about knowing what's there. I mean, that's what our business is. So we're doing sort of sampling comprehensive across the site to provide you data right from the bacteria through to the sort of mammal size that we, of what's there as best we can at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you have a view?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Very similar to Susan. So to complement that, when we move above the water and the soil layer, what we're looking at there, and again, with a view, if you're looking at a project to invest in, and what the potential of that project is to really, to qualify and quantify in detail what's there. What is the, again, starting with the landform stability. Is it a suitable environment to rehabilitate? Looking at what species are there today, and also identifying at a very early stage what the potential issues and threats are going to be to that project. So what does that project present in terms of a risk profile for you as well, in terms of that rehabilitation? If you can identify at the onset of any, rehabilitation, which is what we're primarily focused on, at the start of any rehabilitation program, what the issues are, you can mitigate them. Or it may be that, it doesn't fit within the risk profile for that, or the cost basis for, what it's actually going to cost to rehab that land is out. What you don't want to see, and Peter, I think you mentioned, and Nainish, you mentioned as well, you're looking at making investments that are 15 to 25 years. And, nature-based solutions do take 10, 15, 25 years to reach their full potential. You can't course correct at year 15 or at year 20 if things aren't going to go as expected, or there are issues. You need to course correct at the very early stages if you're to see the potential of those projects in year 15 and year 25. And that's what we're really focused on, is, again, looking at again, building a huge data set that's very detailed, that allows you to make those decisions early on in the process.
And that's a great point. And I'd love to get Nanish's view on this as well. But, I mean, it's interesting when you were talking about your client base. I didn't pick up any forest funds. And I get approached by forest funds and companies all the time to invest in them. And yet it just doesn't seem to me that they've done the pre-work. So they're not coming to us with that data. I mean, do you have any views, or maybe Nanish wants to put it, tell me I'm wrong, but do you have any views on how maybe a broader scale of uptake by different participants, like forest funds, for instance, could address my problem as an investor in this?
I think I'm being sort of client confidential to some extent. We have been approached, and we are talking increasingly to impact funds. And the whole reason I joined NatureMetrics was to focus on the finance side, basically because the interest from finance in general, there's so much on biodiversity right now in finance. And so, I specifically come in because of the increasing contacts we're getting from, and I say I can't really mention client, from very, very large scale sort of investors, multilateral banks, and so forth. So yes, we'd like, I mean, that's partly down to us to promote our technology more. We feel we're at that tipping point now. As I said, we just announced yesterday a Series A sort of successful raise. We're opening new offices, we're becoming bigger. So we're at that tipping point now of becoming bigger. So we want to scale up. So these sorts of opportunities to talk about the technology. And I think what is frustrating is, you know, we see a lot of sort of conversation around the metrics and a lot about, you know, oh, it's not possible, there isn't the data, and actually there are new technologies now, and I think it would be great if we got invited to speak at more of these events where we can start talking about these. You know, we've got so much technology now, that new technologies from satellite, from DNA, from, you know, we even have bioacoustics now that listen into the health of ecosystems from the noise, and people just aren't hearing about these new technologies. So yes, so it's partly on us to do that marketing, but I think increasingly the noise around biodiversity is getting louder and louder, whether it's from the taxonomy, the disclosure, from people signing up to principles. You know, there's all sorts, hopefully, that's going to be driving people to look for new solutions. But yes, it would be great if more forest funds came to us.
I guess a question then is, speaking as an investor, your users, what do they expect from you? What's their use of the data that you're generating and creating? What's their use for it?
It's about establishing that baseline. I think it's a lot of it's about baselining and monitoring, and it does depend on the project. So as I say, if they are more sort of restoration, conservation focused red projects or whatever, then, you know, we can demonstrate a lot of different things. So, you know, there's a red project we've been working on where there's an associated fisheries benefits. You can see the advantage of a technology like ours. So it is about sort of ensuring the sort of, I mean, I think the lady in the last session mentioned there's a lot of focus on impact rather than sort of positives. So we do get asked a lot about, we do the sort of initial due diligence kind of, you know, screening for protected species. But for these sorts of projects, for which I guess we've done a lot on the sort of conservation and more increasingly on forestry, it's about that baselining and monitoring. And as I say, going forwards, we want to work more on sort of soil health as well. So we've got interest in that sort of, you know, whether we can link soil health and yield. And that's kind of a longer term project. We don't do that at the moment, but we're aiming to do those sorts of things. So I think we provide a lot of benefits. So in terms of interest, it could be on site selection, it could be on, you know, baselining, or it could be looking for individual species. And, you know, as an example, as a byproduct, I mean, sorry, this is not a forestry related, we did a project for WWF who were asking us to look for the river dolphin and the manatee. But just an example, you know, as a side benefit of that project, we came back with sort of 675 sort of vertebrate species, you know, from howler monkeys to tapirs that were also there. Or another project where we found sort of 12 red list species they didn't know was there. So, you know, it's sometimes what I'm saying is the information that comes out maybe wasn't what they were expecting, but they're calling us in for that baselining monitoring and to find out what is there. And it was, you know, these nature-based solutions that don't know what nature is there. I mean, it's you know, you've got, in order to measure biodiversity, you've got to look at the biodiversity. So it's about that baselining. That's what people want, really, the information.
Okay, Adam, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, the only thing I would add is really what we see is the drive from the regulators. So the industries that we're working in, the real focus, you know, where we actually see the drive, you know, rather than this being a voluntary, you know, activity that the different projects or different organizations undertake, is when it's been driven by the regulators. And we find that industries that have strong regulation around rehabilitation or around biodiversity and, you know, offsetting or restoring that net loss are the ones where we see the most use and most pull from our services. And to date, that hasn't been within the forestry sector. It's primarily been within the mining sector. And then, you know, following on from that within large government projects such as HS2, for example, where there's a you know, a big focus on the restoration activities there. And in those particular environments, we're able to provide complete transparency, you know, from literally the seedling that's planted, or from the aerial seeding that we do, right the way through to a mature, you know, grassland, shrubland, or you know, the trees and the other associated species with that. So I think it really, you know, where we're seeing, you know, we think that regulation has a massive part to play in this, and for, you know, we expect as the regulations, especially around carbon, tighten up, that we will see greater demand for this. And as Susan mentioned, it's on us to show what's possible as well. You know, a lot of the clients that we speak to aren't aware of the art of the possible. So it's really upon us as well to make sure that everybody understands what is actually possible with the data collection techniques that we have, and with, you know, technologies such as machine learning, for example, how we can apply those at scale. Because many survey methods at the moment are reliant on, you know, very small sample sets from either on the ground surveys or see very large sample sets from satellites, which again, as I mentioned, you know, very challenging in terms of when you're looking at early stage restoration. So it's looking at, you know, making sure that people are aware that we can apply these modern techniques to, projects that, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of hectares in scale. They're not niche projects. These are all mainstream technologies now that can be applied to any type of project.
Yeah, I mean, I think you touched on a great point there, Adam. I mean, again, as an investor, I think regulation is key to me. It's just a basis. I want to invest. I want to make sure that there are boundaries here. That someone's not just coming to me with a blank piece of land and saying, "Hey, let's grow some trees and we're going to do some good." There has to be some standards, and I hope that regulation does improve, because that, as an investor at the moment, it feels a bit like Wild West. However, I've got a great question that's sent through. I think this is directed at Susan, and I want to go to the questions because we don't have much time. Would eDNA be able to measure the green water level, the coolant of a natural aircon, and the cooling power of a natural aircon via the DNA of a forest/stroke landscape?
I don't understand that question. I have to be honest. The coolant of the natural air conditioning.
Yeah,
the eDNA.
aircon.
Quite what that.
Yeah.
Do you mean
of the natural air condition? Yeah, aircon. So I think what it's saying is, can eDNA measure the green water? So trying to provide, I presume, how much cooling power is that forest producing?
cooling
From
power?
the air, yeah. As in taking out, I would imagine, carbon. It's going to cool down the atmosphere. I think that's what the question is.
Yeah, I mean, we measure species, so we don't measure carbon. So I wasn't sure whether it was when we take samples from water.
Maybe it should be aimed at Adam, actually, more.
Maybe it's Adam, yeah. It should be better to Adam, I don't know if you understand that, but we are looking at whether we can extract DNA from the air, but yeah.
Yeah, no, I think, I mean, if you're able to build up now, we don't, this isn't something that we measure, but I think, the beauty of, being able to acquire this level of, species level data. And, in terms of, if you look at the biomass of any particular ecosystem as well, I think around 50% of that is carbon. But if you look at specific species, composition of different species within that, if you're looking at traditional, let's say, for, a lot of restoration projects in the past have been based on monoculture. So you've got single species. So it's very easy to work out what's happening when you've got single species. You just count the trees, right? You've got 10,000, 100,000 of the same tree. The metrics or the, the mechanisms that are at play there. When you're looking at a biodiverse ecosystem, for example, you're looking at maybe 100, 1,000, maybe thousands of different species that are within that, all with their own different characteristics. And that becomes much more complex to model. That's why you need, the enhanced data acquisition techniques, either via the remote sensing, we use drones, and obviously ground-based surveys. We're agnostic to how that data is collected. But once you have that, if you're able to build up that more detailed picture, then you can build models to measure this. So, I haven't seen that done today. I don't see why, it couldn't be achieved.
Okay, here's a great question. Sorry, cut you up, but
no,
it's time. And this one's nice and simple. I think we can answer this one. All of us might have an opinion. How can we make sure the technologies not only fit the needs and wants of big financial players, but are also usable for smaller players and actually help the fight against biodiversity loss? That's a great question, because I think this is the problem of finance, but please answer.
I think, well, I mean, from the point of view of our technology, I mean, we like to quoting online, but just to give you an order of magnitude, typically one sample with one taxonomic group is £275, and the additional taxonomic groups another £100. So I think relatively, obviously you'd want more than one sample, but you on a small project with, carefully placed, small number of samples, it wouldn't necessarily, it's not a prohibitive cost. And I think people are sometimes surprised when we talk about DNA and sequencing, people probably think it's a lot more. Going back to the example of the sort of 200,000 hectares, that would be more like you'd be approaching more like 200 samples for something of that scale. So I think it is, relatively affordable as far as new technologies go. And I think in terms of, where we're going with this is more on the consultancy side about, yes, looking sort of at the biodiversity and what's missing and how you bring that biodiversity back. And I think one thing we should say is we don't aim to necessarily replace ecologists, but we think it's a tool for ecologists who can then look at what's there and sort of work with the forest owners to then bring in, so they can see what's happening and then make the necessary, and it refocuses their time on doing what's best for bringing in biodiversity. So I think it's a tool to help people manage biodiversity and deliver real benefit. So in that sense, that's where we're going.
Yeah, and we provide our services on a per hectare basis. So we work with some very small projects, some of them 10, 15 hectares. We survey sites at 5 hectares. It doesn't take long; it takes a few minutes. To other projects which are tens of thousands of hectares as well. So we have a consumption model that's very similar to the software world, as a service. So you consume the insights that you need on a per hectare basis. And again, I'd echo what Susan says there. This isn't to replace ecologists. A third of Dendra, or maybe over a third of Dendra, is ecologists. And this is really to help ecologists and environmental site managers really focus on the key issues, to give them that data, to empower them to make the right decisions and allow people to manage bigger projects in a more optimized and cost efficient way. I think just to answer one of the other questions that I see in the chat there's a question around students and graduates, and is it a false promise to train them in interdisciplinary data collection for the purpose of creating baselines and reporting on the evolution of biodiversity and quantifying impact? And I would say no, absolutely not. It's not a false promise. I mean, we're desperate at Dendra to hire. We hire a lot of out of university graduates with that skill set because they don't exist in the market today. And so absolutely, we please check out our we're hiring. So please check out.
Good. I'll make sure my son applies. There's a couple of questions there, Nainish, on an investor. I don't know if you can see the chat.
Yes.
And if we can just skew it to technology, because this is a technologies panel. If you want to address the one on the carbon project, so the question is asking what sort of information would an investor want on a carbon project. And the next point, which I think is really key to store, that not all stakeholders are investors, and this is a very important point. And I think we should come on to that. Because I think technology can be used not just about financial return, but it can be used for good. So maybe Nainish, you can take the investor question.
I mean, okay, if we try to just keep a pure capitalist hat on for the moment and take off the slight ESG slant that that we all have nowadays in all the investments we make, but from a pure investment perspective, the problem comes when you're making these investments is trying to work out what is your revenue stream going forward. And it's unfortunately, or fortunately, I'd say fortunately, actually, it is ever changing given the way the world is moving forward. At some point, carbon credits underpinned everything. And that just, the projects that were determined on carbon credits, they came to a swift end because the price of carbon credits is too volatile to actually do any sort of long-term planning on. So there is as I say, it also depends geographically where you're making your investment, where the projects are, because they all have different incentives, they have different cost bases, and they have different measurements. And we go back to something you mentioned earlier, Peter, about the regulatory environment, because you have to work through the regulations to work out where can you make your revenue. And without understanding your revenue, understanding your costs, the project isn't going to be successful, because at the end of the day, it all boils down to, unfortunately, the net cash flow. And over the life of the project, you have to have a very positive net cash flow to make it all worthwhile. So I'm sorry, there isn't one straightforward answer there. I'm sorry for teaching everybody to suck eggs, but we all have a habit of thinking grandiose and hoping for the best, but it does end the day boil down to, you've got to make sure you've got more cash coming out than you've got going in, and you have to work with the environment that you're investing in to ensure that it works in that manner.
Yeah, I mean, I like I said, we've been investing in this area so long, it's changed so much. So this is, if we come to stakeholders, why did we originally invest? It was because we liked the environment. That was key to us as well. And like I said, we thought this was a long-term, actually small return investment. It wasn't something we were putting in. We understood it was illiquid. You can't invest in a forest and then flip it in a few years. You're investing for much longer time duration. But I guess, you know, what's happening in today's world with ESG becoming popular, a load of different players coming in, I do feel we are losing why do we invest in the forest, and biodiversity is key. I mean, you know, the worst thing I would want, if I was going to invest in a forest purely for carbon capture, the worst thing I want to hear is, but Pete, you've actually destroyed species. You've actually made things worse, not better, you know, on the face of it. And I get this comes down to technology and data, as we're touching, because at the moment, there isn't that much around people telling us what you guys do is great because it gives us something. But we need more of something, I feel. We need to invest much more in technology and much more in data. So we know that when we do invest in these projects, that we're not going to destroy what we're actually trying to achieve.
But just one comment there is, you know, you as one stakeholder might have one objective of what's good and bad, and the other stakeholders have different objectives.
This is true, and this is a great time because I've just been told to wrap up before we see an investor argument. but I've been told to wrap up. Look, guys, it's been a great panel. I've loved meeting you all. I'm sure we're going to continue our private conversations. And I want to thank everyone for attending. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Goodbye.